Welcome back to another podcast in our Sacramental Prep series. These programs are a production of the Faith Formation team at St. Julie Billiart Catholic Church in San Jose, California. In this series, we'll be exploring the question, are we spiritual beings?
Now, I don't believe in the Tooth Fairy, I don't believe in Father Christmas, I don't believe in God.
There is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate.
How can educated people in this day and age still believe in God, in heaven, in Jesus? It baffles me. It's a mystery.
Belief in God is childish and immature, just like belief in Santa Claus. It's great for the children, but not something for respectable adults.
There is probably no heaven, and no afterlife either.
God? Really?
What about you? Do you believe in God? For hundreds of thousands of years, the existence of God was something that most people just took for granted. If you questioned God's existence, people thought you must be crazy. But today, many people just aren't sure. Some of the people who deny God's existence have made a career out of it, like this fellow, Richard Dawkins.
I'm a scientist, and I believe there is a profound contradiction between science and religious belief. There is no well-demonstrated reason to believe in God, and I think the idea of a divine creator belittles the elegant reality of the universe. The time has come for people of reason to say enough is enough.
Many other prominent thinkers take exactly the opposite point of view. For example, here's Andrew Klavan, an American writer who has documented his journey from agnosticism to Christianity.
But the one thing that I know for a fact is that there is nothing in science that should stop you from having faith that you are a created being and that your conscience and moral sense has a relationship with somebody, with another will in the universe.
So these days, it's not at all uncommon for people to ask questions such as, well, what is God? Does he even exist? How in the world can I be sure? Are we all connected somehow? And if we are, then how? In fact, who are we? What are we? How are we different from all of the other things that we see in the world around us? Ultimately, are we just animals? Or are we like animals but more intelligent? Or are we different from animals in some other way? For example, are we spiritual beings? And if we are, what does that mean? What difference would it make? These are the questions that we'll be addressing in these podcasts, and we'll begin by looking at how science might answer some of these questions and why they would answer them the way that they do. In the year 1735, a Swedish naturalist named Carolus Linnaeus wrote a book in which he divided everything in the world into three categories. There were animals, there were minerals, and there were vegetables. Now, since human beings are among the things that exist on the planet, pretty clearly we have to fit into one of these three categories. But which one are we? For most scientists, the answer is pretty obvious.
If we're not animals, what are we? Are we plants or trees or flowers? No, we're not. Then, okay, we're not plants. Then are we microorganisms, really tiny microscopic things? No, we're not. Then the natural conclusion must be we're not living things. Well, that's not true. Yes, we are animals.
And so, scientists concluded that we must be animals. I mean, what else is there? Now, at about the same time that they reached this conclusion, they began to ask themselves, well, if we are animals, what does that mean? Where did we come from? They also began learning a lot more things about the planet Earth. For example, they learned that the age of the Earth was just about 4.5 billion years old. And life began on the planet relatively quickly, about 4 billion years ago. The earliest life forms don't look very much like what you and I think of when we say the word animals. They were single-celled creatures like this amoeba. Now, microorganisms like this amoeba are still very much with us today. All you have to do is get a sample of water from almost any pond, look at it with a microscope, and you're almost sure to find thousands of these things. And in spite of the fact that they don't look very much like what we would call animals today, we give them that name because they do the three things that all animals do. The first thing they do is they feed. In spite of the fact that amoebas do not have a mouth or teeth, they can eat other organisms by simply reaching out with their protoplasmic arms and enveloping them. The second thing that all animals do is they fight. Now, when I say fight, what I'm referring to is they compete with one another for food, or in some cases to see which one of them will have lunch and which one will be lunch. Here we see an amoeba receiving an unwanted visit from another microorganism that's called a paramecium. The paramecium is investigating the amoeba to see if it's something that he could perhaps eat himself, but it's an investigation that doesn't end well for the paramecium. And finally, the third thing that all animals do is they have baby animals. In the case of an amoeba, the way an amoeba reproduces itself is it literally tears itself in half using a process that scientists call mitosis. Now, as we said, these single-celled animals appeared on the planet relatively soon after the Earth formed, just 500 million years later. It would take another 3 billion years for these single-celled animals to evolve into creatures that had multiple cells. So, for example, the first worms appeared about 750 million years ago. After that, life continued to evolve into an incredible variety of forms: fish, birds, dinosaurs, and eventually the great apes: bonobos, orangutans, gibbons, and chimpanzees. The first human beings appeared on the planet about 300,000 years ago. And so, what does all of this mean? What does it have to do with the question that we're trying to answer? What are we? Are we just animals, or are we spiritual beings? Well, there's very little doubt that our appearance on the planet was a direct result of the long chain of events that began with the amoebas. Now that scientists have learned to decode the human genome, they can say with relative certainty that our closest living relatives on the planet are the chimpanzees. It turns out that we share roughly 96% of the DNA in our genome with chimpanzees. And the only explanation that science has come up with for this fact is that humans and chimps must have a common ancestor. And so this is the second reason why scientists believe
We are animals.
And yet, there is a problem. Many people object to the idea that we're just animals because of all the things that we can do that animals can't. People can read, they can write, they can do math, they communicate with one another over the internet, and they go to school every day. Animals don't do any of these things. And so before I acknowledge that I'm one of them, I would very much like an explanation. Why don't I behave like them? In order to answer that question, we're going to have to learn a little bit more about how animals really behave. So let's do that next. Now, do you remember when we were talking about amoebas? We said that amoebas do three things. They feed, they fight, and they reproduce. Well, it turns out that they're not the only ones. I'd like to introduce you to my pet dog, Cassius, the wiener dog. Let's take a look at his behavior to see how it is like and unlike the behavior of human beings. Now, biologists tell us that animal behavior is driven by only 3 instincts. In other words, if Cassius does something, no matter what it is, there are only 3 possible reasons why he's doing what he's doing. The first reason is to survive by obtaining food. Biologists refer to this as the feeding instinct. It is a very strong instinct, and this is why giving your dog a little something to eat is such an effective way to train him to do tricks like rolling over or playing dead. The second reason that animals do things is because they think they're competing with other animals for something, usually for food. Biologists call this the instinct to fight. Even very young puppies have this instinct. You can see it when they play with each other, regardless of whether the puppy they're fighting against is real or just a reflection. The third and final reason why dogs behave the way that they do is they do things in order to make puppies. Biologists call this instinct procreation of the species. And so, literally everything that animals do is driven by these 3 instincts. They don't do anything unless they think it will help them either to feed or to fight or to make little baby animals. So what science is telling us is that all animal behavior, including human behavior, is driven by these same 3 instincts. But that doesn't mean that human beings behave exactly like animals, because all animals don't even behave exactly like each other. For example, mammals, like chimpanzees, give birth to their babies in much the same way that humans do. But not all animals reproduce this way. Some, like birds and lizards, have babies by building a nest and then laying eggs in the nest. Many microorganisms, like amoebas, don't have babies at all. When it's time for them to reproduce, they just split themselves in half, using a process that's called mitosis. And then, each of the 2 halves goes off in search of food. There's no parent, and there's no child. Similarly, each animal species also has its own way of responding to the feeding instinct. So, for example, lions respond to the feeding instinct by hunting other animals, killing them, and then eating them. Even microorganisms, like amoebas, will hunt for smaller microorganisms and then feed on them. But almost all of the great apes are vegetarians that respond to the instinct to feed by eating plants, like bananas. Similarly, each animal species also has its own way of responding to the instinct to fight. Now, among animals, the fighting instinct usually gets triggered when there's a famine or a shortage of food. We call it the fighting instinct because when this happens, most animals, like lions or chimpanzees, will fight with each other in order to compete for whatever little bit of food might be available. But even here, not all animals respond to the instinct in the same way. For example, here are a couple of amoebas in a pond where there isn't any food. Now, this triggers the same instinct that we saw in chimps and lions, but instead of attacking each other, amoebas have a completely unique way of finding food, through cooperation. The amoebas will swim together and combine their bodies into a single, larger organism called a slime mold. And where individual amoebas can only feed on things that they find in the water, the slime mold is able to lift itself up out of the pond, drag itself up onto dry land, and then spread across whatever leaves and trees it may find, devouring whatever microorganisms it finds there. So different animals have vastly different ways of responding to the instincts to feed or fight or reproduce. So what? What does it have to do with us? Because human beings evolved from animals, much of our behavior is based on the same 3 instincts that motivate animal behavior. For example, Like animals, we have a strong instinct to feed, and the way some people eat is admittedly pretty animalistic. But at the same time, there's a lot of behavior that's associated with this animal instinct that you simply do not see in animals. For example, unlike animals, we humans cook our meals. We have all sorts of rituals that we observe in the preparation and consumption of our food. But in spite of the fact that these are all very human behaviors, they are still rooted in one of our animal instincts, the instinct to survive through feeding. Similarly, we humans have extended the animal instinct for fighting through competition with one another. We do it in school, in sports, in business. We even compete with one another in the way that we dress. And so we indulge in all kinds of competitive behavior that is very human, but still is really just an extension of our animal instinct to fight. Now that leaves just one of the three animal instincts for us to talk about, the instinct to procreate our species by making babies. But even here, we have extended this basic animal urge to include a lot of very sophisticated mating rituals, from dating to flirting to marriage to parenting itself. We humans have extended the instinct to have babies with a lot of complicated behavior that you simply aren't ever going to see our animal ancestors indulging in. So let's sum up what science has learned about the behavior of animals and how it compares to our behavior as human beings. Everything that animals do is driven by these three basic animal instincts: the need to feed, the need to fight, and the need to procreate their species by making babies. Since human beings evolved from animals, it shouldn't come as a big surprise that a great deal of what we do is also driven by these animal instincts. The big difference is that we have much bigger brains than animals do, and so we respond to our animal instincts in much more complicated ways. What all of this suggests is that the scientists are onto something. We really are animals. After all, not only are we built on a foundation of animal DNA, but our behavior seems to be governed by the same instincts that govern animal behavior. So is that all there is to it? Are we really nothing more than just smarter versions of the chimpanzee? Is our intelligence the only thing that differentiates us from them? Science has come to the conclusion that human beings are animals. They believe this for a number of reasons, not the least of which is genetically, we have a great deal in common with them. Our behavior is also driven by the same three instincts that drive animal behavior: the need to feed, the need to fight, or the need to make babies. And a great deal of what we do is also driven by these same instincts. But not everything. So be sure to join us for the next podcast in this series, where we will take a very close look at things that humans do that no animal has ever done. See you then.